What's going on, everybody? Welcome to my make.com course, Make, but for people who want to make real money. In this video, we're going to be covering everything introductory to make.com, all of the foundational bedrock concepts that you need to understand, like operations, functions, modules, all that boring stuff, before you can actually go out there and make money with the platform. This is the only video where I'm not actually going to be building a high ROI system. Every other video in this course is just all going to be about how do we actually go out and practically build systems that make revenue. So if you are an experienced Make developer, or maybe you are somebody that just is getting started with the platform and wants to learn more without having to spend like 17 hours learning about boring stuff that doesn't really matter, then this video is for you. Stay tuned and let's get into it. Okay, so first things first, why don't we start by signing up for make.com. A lot of people draw this out. Make.com is super simple. All you need to do is just go make.com/en if you're English, or just make.com and it'll default to whatever your language is. At the top right-hand corner of the page, click Get Started Free. If you're watching this in the year 2029, the website probably looks a little bit different. You're going to be confronted with a sign-up page that looks like this. So I've appropriately written my name as Nick Example. I have one of my many burner emails. I have an example password 890. This is super secure. Please do not hack me and everything that I hold dear. And then all you need to do after that is click sign up for free. Next step, it's going to ask you to verify your email account. So I'm going to go over here to one of my many emails. And then I'm going to, because I have this in an incognito tab, just copy the link address and then open it in this page. Now your email address has been successfully verified. Let me just make sure that is the same example password that I had before. And let me make sure that that is the email address that I'm using. Awesome. You will then be confronted with an onboarding/signup page, which is quite self-explanatory. Put whatever the heck you want. None of this stuff really matters. Sorry, make.com data analytics people. Just making your life all difficult. Apparently I'm a student in a company of 2 to 10 people that are using make.com to learn how to milk a cow or something. Okay, so after all that's done, you'll be confronted with a page that looks like this. Now, I'm gonna do a couple things in this video. Number one, I'm gonna go through every single thing in the make.com UX. Like literally when I say every single thing, I mean every single thing. So, I'm going to make sure that no stone is left unturned just so that I can tell people that this is a comprehensive course that goes through everything. That said, I'm not actually gonna spend any time on anything that I personally feel does not matter. I make a lot of money with make.com. 99% of that whole UX dashboard thing, I just never touch. So it's important to understand a couple of these buttons and concepts and that sort of thing, but you don't need to know them in order to do well and in order to do the thing that you guys are all interested in, which is driving revenue. Now, I just signed up for an account. Realistically, what you're going to want to do is, if you're watching this video, you're probably going to take make.com seriously. So head over to subscription, change this to build monthly, and then buy the $18.82 a month plan. Pro is everything that you're ever going to need. If you ever have over like a 250 megabyte file size, you've done something extremely wrong. It also prioritizes scenario execution, and quite frankly, it's just worth the other $8 a month. Totally 100% worth it. Full text execution, log search, all that stuff. Operations usage, flexibility, yada, yada. I haven't really found a good use for Teams yet, so I'm just not gonna go into that. But what I'm going to do is now I'm gonna sign on to one of my accounts that actually has a paid license, just so that we can see all of the buttons and everything like that on the left and the right-hand sides. So that's how to sign up for Make. I don't have a credit card for you all to use, so you unfortunately are going to have to deal with that. But assuming that you've signed up, this is what your setup is going to look like. In the top left-hand corner, we have the organization tab. My organization is 1 second copy because I'm using the make.com account for my agency, 1 second copy. Yours will probably be something different. We have a bunch of subscription information over here. So as you see, my current plan is Legacy because I've been with make.com for quite a while, back when they were called Integromat. They had a very different pricing structure back then where I could pay about 99 bucks for 150K ops, billing intervals monthly, all that stuff. This is just subscription information. This is an operations graph to show you how many operations you're using. Now, an operation is defined as just one module execution, and I'll go into all that later, but this is something that I'll just sign on every now and then and just take a look at. I don't really use it day to day. It's interesting sometimes to model the spikes in operations and to ask myself where that's coming from and that sort of thing. You don't really have to worry too much about it. Data transfer, you will almost never ever hit this cap unless you're doing something absolutely ridiculous. I was consulting with somebody once that was using make.com to build these massive Figma flows, and they had 50 gigabytes used per month. That is basically never going to happen. As you see, I'm almost halfway done all of my ops usage for the month, and I haven't even used like 1% of my data transfer. So don't worry too much about that. You can upgrade by clicking this button. You can buy extra operations on like a flat basis. This will just take you to like a Stripe page, and it'll kind of go from there. You can also enable auto purchasing here. Now, I never do this. I think that auto purchasing is kind of dumb because the cost for auto purchasing is actually more than just buying extra ops. So it's almost like they punish you for trying to think ahead. So don't do any of that. And then down here, you'll just have a list of your active scenarios. But there are better ways to get that information. Okay, anyway, as I mentioned, I will literally go through all of the tabs here and tell you what they are all about. So next up is the Teams tab. I basically never use this. You may use this if you're on the Teams plan and you have a bunch of teams, but realistically, probably not something you're ever gonna have to worry about. Users, this is obviously just a panel with a bunch of different users at your company. You can see we got me, we can see we got some other person at the business, not super important. You can just invite people into your Make.com workspace if need be. There's a subscription tab here, which obviously just covers all of the subscription information that we went over earlier. There's then a payments tab, which logs all of the past billing periods and all that stuff that have undertaken. You can download PDFs, invoices, receipts. This is important if you have a business. There's installed apps here, which is just a list of all of the various applications that you yourself have installed. Make.com allows you to create your own apps, which is pretty interesting. Again, that's something that I basically never do. A lot of these are just experiments between me and a business partner of mine at the time. You're probably not going to have to use this or even like worry about this page at all, but it just allows you to uninstall stuff on the right-hand side, just to really max out data security. Next up is variables. I'm not going to click this tab because Make.com has some like execution variables or whatever that you can query in order to read things like your execution logs and that sort of thing. But if you just click on that, it'll just be a list of variables like organization ID or something, and then like a big list. And then over here, scenario properties. I have never, ever clicked this button. I am learning about this with you guys. No idea what the hell this is. Looks like if you're on some enterprise plan, then you can keep your long list of scenarios organized. Organization is one of the weakest parts of Make.com. It's very, very easy to get overwhelmed with like a disorganized flow. So I guess they're trying to sell that as an upsell now. Same thing here with team. You'll notice that one of the downsides of Make.com is that a bunch of the tabs and stuff like that are just the same info. As I mentioned, I love this platform, but it can be a little bit rough around the edges at times. So if you see that, just don't worry about it. We're probably going to go through the same info 2 or 3 times as we progress further. Now, notification options is something that is actually important. There are different ways that you can error out in Make.com. If you error out once, the scenario will give you a warning. And a warning is something that, it's not like the end of the world, end all be all. I actually receive quite a few warnings every day. When you have 50 different flows out, odds are eventually you're going to be accumulating these warnings. And so I don't actually like getting emails about them. I always set mine to off. A lot of the time my warnings are because of like API rate limits or some shit like that. So I always just leave them off. I don't worry about warnings. However, an error is different from a warning. And an error is when your actual scenario does not complete because of one of these issues that I mentioned earlier. And in that case, if one of my scenarios that is making me money is not completing, well, there's a problem. And so I'll actually enable email notifications for that. Likewise, scenario deactivation, well, that's even more secure. If your scenario errors out like 3 or 4 times, I think, then it'll just turn off the scenario to like avoid you using extra ops. That's definitely something that I want to know about, so I always leave it on. So if you are watching this for the first time, I would always set these to off, on. But I mean, maybe you've never used Make.com, maybe you want to get warnings or whatever, then feel free. There's another variables tab over here, same thing that I showed you earlier. Then scenarios. This is where you're going to be spending 90% of your time. This is a thing that actually matters. It lists all of your active scenarios, lists all of your inactive scenarios, it lists all of your concepts, and you're probably never going to use concepts, so don't worry about that. This is what I mentioned earlier about disorganization. And so you can see on the left-hand side here, there are a bunch of these folders. I would definitely recommend like trying to set up folders to organize your life, but you will inevitably get disorganized. That is simply how Make.com works. I've experimented with dozens of different naming conventions. You can see I tried numbers. You can see I tried a bunch of other things. And like, sure, you can organize things from a bird's eye view, but if you're constantly developing things in Make.com, you'll quickly understand that it's just quite a headache to keep things organized. I would at minimum recommend that you have some type of CRM folder, some type of project management folder, and then maybe some type of HR folder. You can see I've sort of like dialed mine out a little bit more granularly. So there's fulfillment, hiring, growth, web application, payroll, blah, blah, blah. Gets pretty deep. Now I'm going to go through the actual scenarios and modules and stuff like that in a second. But because this is the part that actually matters, I'm just going to leave it to the end, and then I'm just going to cover all the other stuff that doesn't matter in like a tenth of the time. Okay, next up are templates. Now, if you are new to Make.com, you've never used this before, this is actually a relatively novel feature where Make.com just shows you a bunch of other people's systems, usually 1 or 2 module flows, just to give you some ideas. If this is the first time that you're using Make, I would definitely just scroll through this, click every single one, and just see some basic concepts, see how scenarios are made in Make. It's pretty damn straightforward. I mean, like, I don't know, get Telegram messages for new Google Sheets rows. So basically, every time a new row is added to a Google Sheet, you will just send out a Telegram message. Pretty self-explanatory, but it's nice just to see what's possible with Make.com. You can do stuff like, call weather APIs, right? Tons of stuff. You'll learn some introductory information about routers and that sort of thing. Give this a solid 5 minutes. Like, if you're new to this, pause the video right now, go to us1.make.com/templates if you're on the US server, and then just scroll through this and just like understand what is possible, right? There's some stuff about AI. It's pretty neat. That said, after you read through it, you will never have to use it again. So ignore it. Connections. This is basically just a giant list of every authorized connection that you have ever made between Make.com and another platform. I never ever use this unless I receive some API error, in which case I'll jump on here and then I'll just click reauthorize. I do that like once every like 3 months, so I wouldn't worry about it. Webhooks. This is important. Make.com lets you set up recipient server addresses, basically, which you can use in other services to send a request to. We use webhooks all the time in my companies. And in this video course, I'm going to show you how to use webhooks as well. That said, this tab isn't super relevant. It just lists all of those webhooks out. So, you're always going to have some type of like security or verification process. So sometimes it's nice to just have the URL for your own record keeping, but not really. Next up are keys. You can set up API keys in Make.com. I never ever use this feature. I usually just hard code them directly in the scenario. So probably not going to use that either. Devices, this is where you can set up like a mobile phone app. Make.com has a mobile phone app that can be relevant. I've set up a flow with this one time out of like my 1,000 days or 900 days using this software, where basically it was like a contractor or something like that like needed to be able to click a button on their phone and use that to start a scenario. Realistically, you're probably not going to ever use this feature, so I'm just going to skip past it. Data stores is really interesting, and this is very controversial in the community. If you guys watch the first video that I did in this course series, you'll know that I talk a lot about, well, there are a lot of people out there that like are teaching people how to make .com flows, but they don't really use it for money. This is a feature that a lot of those people use. This is like a database, essentially. So Make.com lets you set up your own database in Make, which is cool. But I almost never, ever use it because I'm usually like functionally handling or managing some third-party service like Airtable or ClickUp or some project management platform or whatever. And so what I will always do is I will use those data stores as the source of truth, and I'll never screw with my own database really ever, just because it's not super relevant or super necessary. To me, this just adds an extra layer of complexity in the process, and let's be real, we're not software developers here, or at least most of us aren't. We're just doing this because we want to connect business platforms and apps to each other. You don't really need like a different database to do that. You can just do it directly in those apps. And then finally, there are just a bunch of data structures that you could set up. Data structures, I don't really ever use these either. Some people disagree with me, but I will just always I'm never going to set up like another data structure. For me, like iteration and MVPs are super important, and I just want to get them out the door as quickly as possible. This is more like software architecture. This is more like data engineering, not something that's really relevant to me. But this does just list all of the various data structures that you have. And a data structure, for those of you that aren't familiar, is basically just like a JSON object, like ID. I don't know. You can basically set up like a schema or something like that, I think it's called, where your apps will expect an object with an ID key and a name key, and you can just hard code that in. Way ahead of the curve, not super necessary, so I'm not going to touch into it anymore. My apps, similar to the apps that we saw listed before, these are just places where you can like create your own Make.com apps. Again, probably never going to use it. And then we're almost done with the boring shit. And then Resource Hub, which is Make.com's own like built-in academy. They are supposed to, help you learn key concepts and that sort of thing. I'll be honest, as long as you have more than 3 brain cells, you're probably not going to need this. As long as you have more than 3 brain cells and you watch my course, you're not going to need this. But sometimes it can be informative if you don't understand some of the fundamental concepts like, ops and modules and how to filter and that sort of thing. So feel free to check this out on your own time. I'm not going to go into it. Notifications, if scenarios are paused or if there are warnings or errors, this is where you'll get them. I will never ever click this button. I'll just use my own email. There's also a little help desk here, which you can see does something similar to the resource hub. There's like a help, a community, Make Academy, contact support. I've never used this once in my whole life. And then there's like an organization or account information up here where you can like check out an affiliate program. So I'm like a Make.com affiliate, for instance. I should really be plugging that in my videos, actually. I set up, you can set up your profile info, like your first name, your last name, your email, all that stuff. You can screw with your time zones, email preferences, the same thing that I mentioned earlier, where you can set up errors and warnings, that sort of thing. So yeah, all of this stuff is pretty fairly straightforward. So I'm not gonna dial into that. Okay, now we are finally done with all of that boring stuff that doesn't actually involve making money on the internet. We can actually dive into how scenarios work, how to build one for the first time, what an operation is, what an execution is, how filters work, that sort of thing. By the end of the next 15 to 20 minutes, my goal is, you should know everything that you need to know in order to just like get up and running and automate your emails or something. So without further ado, let's do it. Now that we're back in the scenarios tab here, which is the tab that you are actually going to be spending 99% of your time in, if you click the top right-hand corner of the screen, you'll be able to create a new scenario. And this builder here is really the important part of Make.com. This is Make.com, really. And there are a couple of different buttons on the screen that I want to go through. The first in the top left is how you name your scenario. So this is the title of your scenario. And so I will always get in the habit of just writing out my title first because I want to define what it is that I want this scenario to do, just from an organization perspective, before I actually go out and create it. So in this case, this might be turn Google Sheets row into an email. Let's just pretend that we're going to build that. On the bottom left-hand corner, you have a button that you can click to run the scenario once. This is a manual execution, and you're going to use this all the time when you're testing a scenario. Underneath that, you have a way to schedule your scenarios. This basically just turns it on or off so that now it's automated. You don't have to do it one time. Here you have the ability to schedule at what intervals you want your scenario to run. So maybe I want mine to run at regular intervals every 15 minutes. Maybe I want mine to run once at this date and time. Maybe I want to run it on the 3rd and the 15th of the month at 4:44 p.m., right? You have a lot of freedom, which is really cool. One of the reasons why I like Make.com. It bundles in like crons. There's so many different pieces of functionality that you're able to accomplish here. Next up, you have a save button, which is how you will save the scenario. Only losers ever click this button. If you're cool, you will always hold Command and press S. So don't be a loser. Or I guess Control S if you're on a PC. Here are some scenario settings. Now, people wax poetic about this stuff. The only function I will ever use in this scenario settings button is every time I create a new scenario, I will always just go allow storing of incomplete executions, and I'll turn that to yes. The reason why is because it allows you to use error handlers, which I'll teach you about in another video. There is an area to do notes. I'll be honest, the note feature blows and nobody cool uses it. There is a way to auto-align modules. So let me pretend that I'm creating a scenario and we're using Goggle Sheets. And I'll explain what all these do in a moment. And the cool part about Make.com is you can drag and drop stuff. You can move them around however you want, right? If you click this auto line button, all it'll do is it'll just bring it back to like a set distance and make it look kind of pretty. Unfortunately, the auto line feature looks really ugly when you have a bunch of routers and stuff like that. So I don't actually use the auto line feature ever. I'll just like autistically try and like line it up so that it's perfect and build out my own basically Make.com art. But it's useful for some people. And then the last real button that matters is this explain flow button, which is for some reason an airplane. I don't know what the engineers were thinking there, but this allows you to just see where the data is coming from and where it's going. I don't really use this feature that often, but in more complex flows where you have like a bunch of routers and stuff like that, you may click this button every now and then just to see, okay, which route goes first, which route goes second, which route goes third, that sort of thing. You then have these 3 little settings dots where you can do things with blueprints and version control. And a blueprint is basically just like a file that represents your whole Make.com scenario. So I can export a blueprint and that'll just be like a big JSON file. And then if I want to import it again into another Make.com account, I can, and it'll have these modules kind of preset. And so it's basically just a way of like sharing blueprints for scenarios back and forth. You still have to do stuff like connect, which I'll cover in a second, but it's still pretty cool, all things considered. Okay, great. So why don't we actually go ahead and make a brief little scenario here, right? Showing is way better than telling. First things first, you click this button. You'll then be able to use one of like 3,000 or something software platforms. I would always recommend, and I love doing this maybe once a month, just start at the top here and then scroll down through every single software platform. Odds are you'll see a lot of platforms that you either didn't expect to see on make.com, or you'll just see a bunch of features that you can use that might give you some ideas for how to build out better flows that make you guys more money. So yeah, I'll usually do this about once a month. I'll just give it a click and scroll through. It's like, whoa, Android? You can automate Android? It's like, yeah, you can. You can like use this to automate various features on your freaking Android phone. It's crazy, man. So many features. I could scroll down this thing for hours probably, clicking through every single API integration. It's amazing. Now, I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to use that Google Sheets example that I showed you guys earlier, because I want to explain the difference between a trigger and an action. So once you click into one of these apps, you will see a big list of all of the built-in make.com endpoints, and essentially what the engineers at make.com and the engineers at the software platform have thought that you're probably going to want to use the software for. So there are triggers and then there are actions. A trigger is adequately named and it's kind of self-explanatory. This is something that will trigger your flow. You see up here at the top, watch new rows is a trigger. What this means is every time a new row is added to a Google Sheet that you've specified, this scenario will run. You'll see there's watch changes. This is a little bit more granular. It says triggers when any cell is updated. You'll see that sometimes you'll require various add-ons or extensions inside of your Google Sheet in order to make this work. Perform a function. There's another trigger here. It's like an endpoint called perform a function. When data is passed to a make_function or an integromat function in a sheet, and you have a certain extension installed, then you can turn on your flow. The vast majority of the triggers and stuff like that, you probably don't need to know. Really, the only one that I really ever use is just watch a new row or watch a new entry into like a database, CRM, or project management tool, and just use that to like start some aspect of the process. So anywho, without further ado, I'm going to click watch new rows. And then what'll happen after you give that a click is a little Google Sheets module or modal is going to pop up. And then the very first thing you're going to need to do if you don't already have one is you're going to need to set up a connection. And so on your screen is probably going to prompt you to click add. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to pretend that I'm setting up a connection for the first time. A connection is just Make's way of getting into your systems, logging into your account, basically. Like if we want to automate things on your behalf, we're going to need to be able to log in on your behalf. And that's what make.com is doing here. So there's some best practices for connection names, but I'll always write whatever the company name is or the property name. So in my case, 1 second copy. And then I'll also write the date. And this is something that I only recently started doing, but I found that this is significantly better from an organization perspective. Now, since we're using Google Sheets, it's going to ask us to sign in with Google. Pretty straightforward. And I have a bunch of accounts set up here, but I'm just going to sign in with my info 1 second copy account. This will allow Make to do all of the fun stuff it needs to do, see, edit, whatever my Google Drive files. Okay, great. And then after that checks out, a bunch of, options here will also open in order for you to pick, the specific Google Sheet that you want and that sort of thing. Now, one of the reasons I like make.com a lot more than other platforms is it's actually quite simple. There are a few places where you'll probably trip up. Like if you're using make.com for the first time, you probably don't know what the difference is between searching by path, selecting from all, entering manually, that sort of thing. But you learn it pretty dang quick. If you click search by path, and then if you're trying to select your Google Drive, is it my drive? Is it the drives that are shared with me? Is it the Google shared drive? If you just click this button, you'll see a list of all the various spreadsheets and Google Sheets in your account that you can then just simply one click and then connect to. So in this case, this is my Phantom Buster scrape list, just some random outbound Google Sheet that I set up. You can go and you can select the specific sheet, and then you can just watch for new rows being added to that. Like make.com is simple enough that it'll just walk you through. You generally need to go through in a trigger and just like select every or fill out every field because that's usually how you target the data. But yeah, you have a bunch of options, and I'm not going to go through every specific feature of every specific trigger for every specific platform. That would just be a little too unnecessary, I think. But I am just going to go through sort of like in general how to build things out with make.com. So yeah, you're always going to want a trigger of some kind. I don't use an external database or anything like that. I almost always just use a platform that my clients or me are building on. And so Google Sheets is like the simplest example, but maybe this is an Airtable. Airtable has very similar triggers where you can watch when a new row is added. You can do things by function, all that stuff. Maybe it's ClickUp or Pipedrive, and you can do things like watch when a new entry is created in Pipedrive or ClickUp, right? Same sort of idea. Google Sheets is sort of just like a way for you to get your mental model of how all this stuff works correctly. In most of these modals that pop up, there'll be an advanced settings button, which you can click on to scroll down more. I basically never ever use the advanced settings. There are some cases in which I will, but you don't really ever need to. For the purposes of what we're doing, which is just building out these simple flows that make large amounts of money, usually the defaults are more than sufficient. Okay, so that is how we set up a trigger. Let's do a limit of 1. Let's click OK. It'll ask you when you want to start, so maybe we'll do all. And if you're paying close attention, you'll notice that there is another circle connected to our module. This is the scheduling circle that I showed you guys earlier. So if I click on this, the same schedule setting is going to pop up where you can define how often you want to run this flow. Let's say I want to do it on demand, it'll switch to a little like cute arrow. Now this scenario is only going to run when I click the run once button, right? So you have a lot of options now you want to set these things up, whether it's an on-demand sort of automation or one that's scheduled at regular intervals. If this is scheduled at regular intervals, let's say 15 minutes, what's actually happening under the scenes is every 15 minutes, Make.com will send a request to your Google Sheet, and it'll compare the last time the last instance of the Google Sheet with the current instance. And it'll see, hey, have I added any new rows, for instance? If I have added new rows, then it'll take that as the trigger for the scenario, and then it'll run the rest of it. If it doesn't find any new rows, then it's not going to run. Pretty self-explanatory, right? Okay, great. So that is a trigger. And why don't we do a module? If you want to create or extend a flow, all you need to do is just click that little plus sign to the right, and it'll automatically create another module, which you can then use to select the software platform that you want to do and that sort of thing. So hypothetically, for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to go to email, and then you'll see now that there are no triggers remaining. There are only actions. And that's because we've already defined the trigger before. This is the thing that's starting our scenario. The only thing we can do here is then do something, create an action or something as a result of that trigger. And so you can see with the basic email module, there are tons of different features that we can do. We can create a draft, we can send an email, whatever. I'm just going to click create a draft now. We're not actually going to run this. I'm just doing this to show you how the email module works. And then, same thing as before, you can add a bunch of connections. Because this is an email module and not like a specific Gmail module, for instance, it doesn't assume that you're using the Google stack. And so you have to select the connection type, whether it's Google restricted, whether you want to do it through IMAP, whether you want to do it through Microsoft Outlook, whatever. But hypothetically, let's just say we're doing this. I'm going to select another connection name. We're then going to authorize another connection. And you'll see the same thing happens here. It's telling us that it's going to allow Make to read, compose, send, and permanently delete all of your emails. So just make sure that that's what you want Make to be able to do. Obviously, it's going to try and push for as many permissions as possible. So don't really worry too much about that. I never really do. And then, now we can actually do things with this email. The email module is a little bit quirky specifically because it asks you to choose a folder. I always just choose inbox for whatever I want to do. But you can see here that you can already start doing useful things. You can set a recipient. And maybe I want the recipient to be me. And maybe every time a new row is added to a Google Sheet, I want to send myself a message saying, new row added to, and then maybe I want to use my sheet ID or the sheet name, right? You can select the content type here, HTML, plain text. Maybe I just want to write a bunch of text. Or maybe I want to be able to write HTML, where it's there's a link here to this Google Sheet or something like that, which would render as an actual link in the person's account or in the email, right? You have a lot of options and you can start structuring this however you want. But as I mentioned, it's quite simple. Make will usually tell you if you need to do something that you haven't done. I just tried to remove the recipient. You can't really create a draft for an email automatically unless you have a recipient, right? So you're going to need to add one. Anywho. That is more or less how the scenario builder works. There are a bunch of other features that you start getting into if you want to build more complex flows. Like right now, we're at the point where we could just build one giant linear flow from end to end. But I'm not going to get too much into them. If you see there's this little gear icon between modules, this is called a filter. If you click on that, then you can create a filter where, let's say I want to do maybe row equals hello. And what you can do is you can set a condition. This will allow you to select variables from previous modules. And so there is, row number accessible, spreadsheet ID, sheet. I have a couple of columns in my specific spreadsheet. One's called geography, one's called URL. So I can actually select from that. But let's say geography has to equal Canada. This will filter out anything where the geography tab in my Google Sheet is not equal or is equal to Canada. Sorry, this will filter out anything that is not equal, and it'll continue the progression of the row for anything that is equal. And you can add multiple conditions if you want. You can add OR conditions. You have a lot of freedom in how you want to set up these filters. When a filter is set up, the little wrench icon will change to this filter icon. And so it's just important to be able to keep that in mind. Make has a little bug right now where the filter name doesn't pop up unless you drag and drop the subsequent module. And so if you drag and drop it, you'll see that that text that you wrote actually pops up. And so it becomes very interpretable and very maintainable, very easy to see. And I actually want to touch on that feature just while we're on that topic. One of the reasons why Make.com is so awesome and why I use it, even though I know how to write scripts and build software and stuff like that, is because of how interpretable it is, which results in clients, at least for my own automation agency, seeing the value in the flows that I build. Like if you think about it, if I just write up a big 200-line block of code and then I just hand it on a silver platter to my client, sure, maybe I'll be like, yeah, it does the thing that you asked it for me to create it for. But there's no real way for them to know. And so a lot of the time they don't really appreciate it as much. But if instead I build out a Make.com flow, and there's a module called Google Sheets Watch New Row, there's a filter that says Geography Canada, there's an email where it creates a draft, right? Even if I'm not like a super techie person and I look at this, I'll know that this is doing something automated with a Google Sheet and an email, and maybe I can actually pin some business value on that. It becomes a lot easier to ascribe successes and really take credit for like these complex business architecture decisions in Make.com versus like a script. And the other really cool part about it is also a lot more maintainable. And what I mean by that is even if I have no idea what the hell I'm doing, and then maybe like my automations guy sends me this scenario, like odds are I can click through that scenario, see where the data is being pulled from, and at least in natural language anyway, start to make decisions like, you know what, I wonder if we could pull multiple entries instead of just one. Is that a possibility? We can communicate in a lot more business savvy way, which is obviously a big advantage if you want to grow a company that makes a large amount of money. Okay, great. Yeah, so there are a couple of other features that I still need to touch on. I did mention how there is a place where you can select the variables from previous modules. That's obviously very important. You see here, since this is a Google Sheet and I only have 2 rows or 2 columns filled out, one's called geography, one's called URL. I don't have any other ones. All we can do is we can just select the C column, select the D column. But usually your Google Sheets have header rows, so it solves that. This is like the place where you'll actually input data or functions or do math or that sort of thing. So if I click on this little gear icon, you'll see that there's some general functions. There are brackets that you can use in Make.com. There are functions like get, there are if empty, switch, omit, pick. The only ones that I ever probably use are if empty. I do use get, and then I do use switch. I don't think I've ever used omit or pick in my whole life, just because their functionality is taken care of by other functions. These are keywords like true, false, ignore, null, erase. Basically never use any of these. And then operators, these ones are important. So, you could say if, I don't know, geography, and then we have to select the equal sign. And then we say Canada, then maybe output true, and then if not, output false, hypothetically. These functions are necessary for building out more complex flows and more logically involved flows. But I'll be honest, a lot of the time, you're barely going to be using these functions. All you're going to be doing in high ROI systems is you're just going to be connecting data source A to field B in another platform. Maybe you'll schedule something that checks every 15 minutes to see if you've gotten an email that matches these filters. And then if you do, then you forward an onboarding email to somebody else, right? these very simple things that don't really require complex general functions. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. A lot of it's self-explanatory. And if you do wonder if you're ever going to use it, make.com has some pretty good documentation where you could just mouse over and then see the kind of documentation or the purpose or use case behind a function. Okay, next up are the math functions. Now, there's some variables here that you can automatically insert, like there's a variable for pi. This is going to render to 3.14 or whatever the hell the other 8 million, well, technically infinity digits of pi are. There's a random function, and so you can use this, and this is something that I will use, to just automatically create a random number on every scenario execution between 0 and 1. That's sometimes useful. If you want to generate a random number between 0 and 10, all you do is you multiply that random number by 10, for instance. There's some functions here that I use from time to time. I'll use average, sometimes I'll use sum. And then down here, there are some operators like multiplication, division. There's modulo, right? You're probably never going to need to use modulo, although it can be useful. There's plus, minus, less than, greater than, all that sort of stuff. Next, we have text and binary functions. There are some variables here that some people will use from time to time. This will automatically create like a unique ID, which is sometimes useful if you want to like add entries into a database or whatever. I don't really use it. I'll just create my own unique ID if I want one. And then there are a bunch of text functions. And I will say some of these text functions are quite useful. So the length of a string. You can use this in place of like a lot of filters. So you could just check to see if the length of something is greater than 0, basically. If it's greater than 0, odds are that field exists. You could lowercase stuff. This is sometimes useful if you're, like when I was creating WordPress posts automatically, you know, the URL. A lot of the time the URL of a post is just like, you know, .com/hello, how are you doing? You usually don't see like big uppercase URLs or whatever. So I would pass all of my URLs through like a lower function, for instance. And then around that, I would wrap it with a replace function. And the way that a replace function works is maybe if you have your URL, you could search for a new line, and then, a space. And then every time you see a space, just replace it with nothing, or maybe replace it with a dash or something. And that way now you have no spaces in your URL, right? There are many features of make.com that allow you to do cool text processing with this. And while text processing isn't really make.com's strength, it's just nice to have that flexibility and freedom. So length, lower, capitalize, start case, ASCII, if I'm pronouncing that right, ASCII, replace, you can trim things, upper, substring. I'm not going to go into all this, but suffice to say that some of this stuff is important. And you'll see me use these in the flows that I build out for it later on in the course. Next are date and time functions. This is actually super useful and probably one of my #1 most utilized tabs in this creator screen. The reason being is because you can set variables like now. And basically the way that make.com date functions work are like, look at the date right now. It says Saturday, February the 17th at 10:05 a.m., right? That is a text string which represents a date. It isn't actually a date. Make.com has its own date time format where you'll just give it a date and then you can turn that date into anything from anything you want, like a text string, or you can turn it into a format where maybe it looks like this instead or something like that. And so make.com's date string, I don't remember exactly how they're written, but it's something like 10:06:03 UTC or something like that. It's going to be something like this. That is total bullshit. There is no vertical pipes there. But it's going to look something like this. It's going to be like a long string of numbers that make.com knows is a date format. And then you can just turn whatever this is into anything else. And so if I were to type now, that now would be equivalent to that. And then make.com also has a bunch of functions that allow you to easily parse the date or format the date however you want. So, okay, here you go. That's the format right there. So 2016-12-28T, and then like a time, and then some Z's or whatever. That's the date format that make.com actually uses under the hood. And so what I could do is I could say format date, then I could say now, and then I want you to format it so that it's day / month / year. What would happen here is it would take the current date time, it would then expand it out to that long number thing that we had earlier. So maybe it'd be 2024-2-02-17T, 10.07.09.37.2Z. So it would generate that, and it would format that into something that is more human legible. Like, okay, it's date, so 17/month, so 02/YYYY, which is 2024. So yeah, date time is awesome, and it's something that I use very often. Sometimes I check to see if the dates are before or after some date that I catch in my CRM, and if so, send out an email or don't send out an email, that sort of deal. And there are a bunch of other functions down here that allow you to do so, which I'll cover when I actually build flows out. Lastly, there are array functions. And I've left this till the end because arrays are something that just a lot of people have trouble with in make.com. I don't actually really use arrays at all. And I know that any make.com developers are going to look at me and like crucify me for saying that, but you really don't need to use arrays. If you start catching yourself using arrays a lot, it's probably because you're trying to optimize operations, which I'll touch on in a sec, and not necessarily because you have to use the arrays. So a lot of the flows that I build out, like I could build it out with like a super long array and I could save myself a bunch of ops or something like that, but I never do. I'll just build it out as simply as possible from start to finish. And that's a principle that I think is more important to touch on, which is simplicity. Like if you're really designing make.com flows to make money and to be maintainable, you want them to be as simple as possible. Nobody's going to give you brownie points for building out this complex, super crazy long flow with 1,000,001 routes. When, if you ever wanted to make a change to that down the line, you'd have to like poke at like 17 different places and frickin', I don't know, draw a pentagram and pray. Like ideally your flows would be so simple that even a novice business owner who has no experience with automations would be able to look at it and be like, oh, okay, we should change this, right? And that's what you should really be going for. Developers have a tendency to like showing off and like, really identifying with their like complex procedural knowledge. That's not us. We're not here to develop super complex flows. We're here to develop flows that make money. And a lot of the time, those are the simpler ones and not the more complex ones. So yeah, these are still useful, don't get me wrong. And I do use these every now and then. And I'm going to touch on how to use them in flows. But the array part, I think, is just one of the reasons why people have so much trouble and difficulty getting up and running with make.com. So I'm going to try and backload that as much as possible. We're not going to have to deal with too much of this. Okay, great. And then you have some custom variables here, which aren't relevant, and I basically never really use them, so I'm going to skip over that. Awesome. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and choose a folder. I'm actually just going to go and delete all these. These aren't relevant. Suffice to say, this is a good introductory session. There are a couple of other buttons down here, stuff like flow control, how to repeat and iterate and aggregate, how to route different decisions and that sort of thing. There's some built-in triggers and built-in actions that some people use a lot in their make scenarios. And then there are also some text parser modules. We're going to get into all of that stuff when I'm actually building practical flows out for you live, and then we're not going to worry about any of that stuff right now. Thank you very much for watching. If you've gotten to this point in the course, which is technically the end of the second video, maybe like the 1.5 video realistically, because I don't really think that first one counts. You now understand, 1, the user experience / user interface of make.com. 2, you understand the 10% of steps and buttons and so on and so forth that actually matter. And you understand that 99% of all the other ones just don't. And you're not really too concerned about that. And 3, you basically know everything that you need to know in order to actually start building out like flows in make.com that can make you real money. And so that's going to be the focus for the rest of the course. We're going to actually take those skills that we learned earlier on over the last half hour or so, and we're going to use them in real flows that you can start applying to your business or a new business today. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, and that sounds like something you enjoy, then keep watching. We're going to get really fun from this course video onwards. Thanks for checking this out. Please like, subscribe, comment, and leave systems that you want me to build below, because I'm going to, over the course of the next 2 weeks, start scheduling those in just so that I can interact with the community more and help you guys out in your specific automation scenarios. Okay, have a great rest of the day and talk to you soon.